Okay, welcome back to the Natural Awakening podcast with me, your host, Whiston, and today is my friend Christopher Wardlaw as guest, whom I recently spent quite a bit of time, just 2 days, I think we were hanging out together in Massachusetts, but it felt like a lot longer because what were we doing during that time, partly, anyway, Chris?
Yeah, we were floating, and we were hitting the blinker and hanging out.
Yeah, the float. So the float tanks, which is not something that I had done before, but Chris kindly invited me to come by and try it out with our shared penchant for altered states of consciousness, which the float tank will induce pretty reliably, and just as way of a little more introduction. Chris, why don't you? Because this conversation is also going to cover some conjunction of Buddhist style practice, concentration and insight practice, and then also that in conjunction with the Roxiva light stimulation device and the flotation tanks. So people know a little bit more about you and your background. What brought you to the Dharma and practice, and maybe a little bit what is your practice background?
Yeah,
so people know a little bit about you in that context.
Yeah, you got it. My name is Christopher Wardlaw. I live in Western Massachusetts. And I came to the Dharma through this man named Tom Bassereer. And I took a class with him at Keene State College on the neuroscience of meditation when I was an undergrad by accident. And then he told me that I should go sit a 10-day meditation retreat in Shelburne Falls, Massachusetts at the Vipassana Meditation Center, which is in the SN Goenka lineage of teaching. And after that first course, I got way more than I bargained for. And
as one does on those Goenka retreats quite often.
Yeah. So
those who know, but for those who don't know, what might you mean by that?
Yeah. So a 10-day retreat in the SN Goenka tradition involves a very regimented sitting meditation schedule. You wake up at 4 a.m., you go to bed around 9. If you follow the schedule right on the money, you're meditating in between like 12 and 14 hours a day. It's, it's seated meditation for the whole bag, and it's pretty dry insight, and very powerful technique, very powerful, real fun if you like that sort of thing. But it is a challenging retreat format, no doubt. I've been practicing in that tradition for coming up on 8 years now. I've sat probably like 20 something residential silent retreats up to 30 days in length.
This man has spent a lot of time with his ass on a cushion.
So with the float tank, I got introduced to the float tank in 2018. I floated a little bit commercially, and I knew that it was going to be part of my life somehow. 3 years later, I got the opportunity.
Okay, well, wait, back up. Why?
Why? Yeah, the float tank is a really magical set of conditions. Particularly, if I were to summate them very tightly, it is approximate weightlessness, silence, darkness, and temperature homogeny. A float tank is a fiberglass tub that is full of about 11 inches of water. Inside of that 11 inches of water is about 1,200 pounds of Epsom salts.
1,200 pounds?
Yeah, it's a ridiculous amount of salt, Whiston. I mean, it's the most buoyant thing ever.
Good God.
Yeah, it's crazy. I mean, the specific gravity of a float tank is 1.265 to 1.28, depending. Some centers like to cork their people a little more than others. But yeah, it's an outrageous amount of salt. That's why you're so buoyant. So it's approximate weightlessness. You float effortlessly. There's no no need to tense anything. The tank will hold you completely. And that if you want to experience prolonged weightlessness in society, or approximate weightlessness, the float tank is really your only option, or skydiving. Take your pick.
One of these has a few more risks than the other.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, definitely, certainly different risk profile.
And a different view.
Yes.
A different view as well.
View.
Yeah.
So the first time I got into the float tank, like, you know, I have sat many hours of meditation in, you know, kind of cells or like these dark closets, right? And I was like, this is the weightless cell. This is remarkable. You can stay in there for, you know, as long as you're comfortable with it. And weightlessness can facilitate long durations of practice. And it also, because of the temperature homogeny, you cannot tell where your skin ends and the water begins, or where the air begins and your skin ends, and, you know, vice versa, all of those factors. So it can facilitate the perception of the dissolution of the boundaries of the body, which is
in complete darkness.
Yeah, in complete darkness too, which very, very much helps. Reduce the sense of dimensionality, like a variety of other factors too. So I just noticed in the float tank, basically, is like these are 4 very special inputs that appear to be less fabricated at first blush than just sitting on your butt. And when I came out of that first float, I mean, I felt amazing. After coming out of weightlessness is just magical. Yeah, it's a magical thing. So once a couple years later, I got the opportunity to work at a commercial float center called Go With The Float in East Hampton, Massachusetts. And once I started working there, I had near unlimited access to the float tank. And I decided to start engaging with it in what I refer to as like high doses. So for the past 3 years or so, I've been floating in between 15 and 30 hours a week for the past.
It's just you've really put the hours in on this one.
Yeah, I mean, I truly believe that as a float facilitator, I have an ethical obligation to understand the full range of the territory that one could encounter in the float tank. So if clients have any questions about the phenomenal experience of the float tank, that I can best answer them, you know, to the best of my ability with the, you know, experience that I've had engaging with the float tank. And I haven't been stumped by a question from a client for a long time. So it definitely, that empirical knowledge of the float tank really helps me be a better float facilitator and to help more people get the most value out of their flotation tank sessions.
To give people a kind of idea of the range of phenomenology that people coming through might experience, that also that you've gone through yourself, maybe we could refer here, you've come up with this kind of model of the phenomenological state space that can and often does open up for people within the float tank, those conditions.
Sure. Yeah. So there's quite a bit of complexity to this, but here we go. People who are floating for 60 minutes in duration, the phenomenon of the float tank is very different than if you're floating for 3.5 hours. You know, a 60-minute to a 90-minute float can even have quite different, you know, phenomenology. Over the years, one of the things that I've been working on is a sort of master list of all of the phenomenon that I've encountered in the float tank over the years. The float tank is also highly sensitive to the proximity to the sleep cycle where you enter it. And this is There is no research about the intersections of the sleep cycle in the float tank. I hope that there will be in the future. But yeah, coming from my own experience, getting into REM cycles in the float tank really opens up the phenomenology of the float tank considerably. Also, as we'll get into more, the intersections of classical Buddhist practices and the float tank also vastly opens up the phenomenology of the float tank. So, yeah, with some of those caveats, you know, a floater who's, you know, coming in off the street for their first float, the main characteristic is going to be novelty. The novelty is extremely high. So, you know, people spend a lot of time like, you know, stretching in the tank, like kind of touching the boundaries of the float tank, you know, which will reify the sense of space that you're in. And
remind you that you're in a bounded space. Yeah.
Correct. Whereas if you stay still in the float tank and you do not bump into the walls, the likelihood that a perception of a less bounded space is highly likely. So people who are doing these shorter duration floats, they report overwhelmingly a profound sense of relaxation. Oftentimes they report different kinds of like phosphene kind of phenomenon, seeing like you know, purple swirls, green stuff, like things that are, you know, like the, you know, closed eye, sober kind of things. Although with a little bit more sophistication in their organization, typically, there people say, I saw the light show. That kind of thing is quite common for floating at these shorter durations. People report time dilation is a big one. And that time dilation is on a variety of different parameters. Like people report having experiences of being in the tank for way longer than they're actually in the tank, or that it went by really, really fast, or that it was actually a sense of timelessness that was predominant. So that's very, very common. People report falling asleep in the float tank all the time, but also maybe even more commonly is people saying, I don't know if it was being asleep, and I don't know if I was awake. So there's a sense of indeterminacy and kind of a not knowing what the state of consciousness is. That is very common for people floating at short durations. And the last thing I'll mention, people also report missing phenomenal time entirely. It's just, yep.
They go in and they're like, what? Time's up?
Yep, time's up. All of a sudden the bell is there and they have no idea what happened to them. Well, yeah.
Like literally no recollection?
Yep, no recollection at all. Just gone. Yep.
Like what percentage of people say that? And when they come out, are they like dazed or confused or like peaceful? Or
certainly, and yes, sometimes. But I will also say that as a floats facilitator, like I don't really ask people how their floats were.
Sure.
Yeah. Rather,
could be intensely personal. You if they want to talk about it, then
yeah. I basically will only talk to people about their experiences if I'm invited to listen to them. And because my job is to make sure that float tank is calibrated correctly and that everything is clean. And lots of people come in and out of the float center and they don't say anything. You know, you're floating in the nude, you know, by yourself. It's incredibly intimate.
You're returning to I would describe it as like a womb-like environment.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. People, you know, report having like perinatal experience of like kind of being like reborn. You know, I feel like a new person. Interestingly, some of the younger people I floated as young as 5, and I've heard kids say, I remember that. The proximity of womb is more like a salient feature of their experience as a child. So, yeah, that kind of perinatal thing is quite common. Yeah, and you know, if someone's rolling up into the tank tired, like, you know, they may hit a REM cycle and like, you know, dreaming in the float tank is absolutely on the table. And then this is kind of where we get into the more interesting phenomenology of the float tank. What is now an appropriate time?
Where do you want to take it from here? We could talk about Buddhist practice, how that interacts, or just, I mean, it could be, doesn't have to be Buddhist. I assume any meditative practice, but we're both kind of steeped in Buddhist tradition, so that's where we're coming from. But you want to talk more about your model of the state space, or do you want to talk about the practice?
Yeah,
first?
sure. I think by talking about the model first, it will segue into the practice quite naturally. So yeah, in my experience with the float tank, there are kind of 5 major kind of like brackets that one could put the float tank experience into. And at first they may appear to come in order, but as one continues with their flotation practice, things get more incepted. And I say that in reference to like the movie Inception, kind of.
Right.
That word should be in the dictionary. I don't know if it means. It's extremely helpful for describing float tank phenomenology, dream yoga phenomenology, like this kind of nested aspect of any given experience having the perception of it being inside of any other, until even that framework too is completely dissolved. And like as one continues through kind of going through every single possible combination of nested state, that there is no nest. Kind of smacks upside.
And the Garuda flies free.
So, but typically, like, I hesitate to say like typically because I'm kind of an N of 1 here.
I mean, I don't know anyone certainly who has floated as much as you have. I don't know if you know anyone.
Yeah, so I do. There are people who have floated, have been exposed to the float tank for far longer than myself, who have had access to the tank since 1978, since its inception.
Sure, of course.
But I do not.
In total hours, though?
So I don't know anyone who has floated this amount of hours over a period of years with this level of consistency. That is like the specific lane that, as far as I know, I'm the only individual that has done it like this. I could be wrong, and I would love to meet more people.
If you have floated for 15 or just a lot, I'm sure Chris would enjoy talking to you.
Please call me. I've been trying to find these people. I know they're out there, but people who have deep float practices seem to often be very, very private. And I'd love to learn more about the socio-cultural reasons why that is. It's super fascinating to me. And yeah, really a major interest of mine is finding other high dose flotation practitioners and discussing the phenomenology of their experience. Hopefully over time this will come. But anyway, back to, what happens when you start floating a lot. The first kind of like space that you come into is the sense that, you are trapped inside of your body, and
well, maybe not trapped, but you're
well,
or do people often feel a real confinement?
Yeah, people do feel a real confinement because the phenomenon of this first stage is often very similar to sleep paralysis phenomenon. I see. Yeah, so you may have the sense that there can be a lot of like tension in the body, as if there's something trying to lift out of your skin. And the perception that like you're no longer looking at like the top of the tank, but rather you're looking outwards can occur. And it can feel like just...
So the sense of lying down, you actually feel like you've switched orientation?
Correct. And whether that orientation may be full or it may be partial. And for a lot of folks, it's actually just their head at the beginning. So they're lying like this. Sure. And then it's like their fingertips are coming up. And the orientation of their eyes is actually like, has changed to see the back part of the float tank. the back wall.
Right.
And
Right.
so much of float tank phenomenology, like the kind of place from which it starts is like the body on its back and then being inside a cube where it has two back walls like this, and then walls like this. And one is kind of suspended in that space. And so in this first space and transitioning into the second one, which is the sense of the body all of a sudden having freedom inside of the float tank to move, but the body is still confined in the float tank.
And this is all happening while you're completely motionless.
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah.
But
good to clarify.
Itself is something that I find people reify often, believe it or not. They're like, I started moving around in the float tank. And the level of certainty at which they say that is very serious.
Sure.
So it should not be assumed that someone would make the connection that
this is the beginnings of an OBE, essentially.
Precisely, yeah. So the idea that the body there is a body that exits the body
right.
as a framework is actually quite a paradigm shifting and ontologically challenging thing.
Yes. Right. So I imagine most people just have the natural interpretation. No, I was actually moving around in it.
Yeah, correct. Which is super super fascinating to see. Just like, how deeply reified it is to be embodied.
We do take this for granted.
Yes. And the float tank will challenge these things. Sometimes in quite short order, depending on one's proclivity here, and why that is, we don't know.
Further research required.
Yeah, right on.
Any research required.
Yes. Go EPRC.
Go EPRC.
By the way, yes, I am a member of the EPRC.
The Emergent Phenomenology Research Consortium, which some of the audience may be familiar with, a research and advocacy organization, a bunch of scientists, clinicians, practitioners, teachers, investigating meditative phenomenology, psychedelics, other things connected to such phenomenology.
Well put.
Yep.
Hard to summarize. Well put. So, in this second space, phenomenon that can occur can involve like the sense of being flushed down the float tank, that you're rotating along the walls of the float tank quite rapidly, and the likelihood that you will have the perception that the physical body is making contact with the wall of the float tank is a salient feature of this experience. The sense that you get kind of curled up really tight in like the corner of the float tank can happen. Like there's almost like a gravity that's pushing against the walls of the tank, and it's compressing further and further. Different kinds of like head first flipping, any kind of orientation that you can imagine that's like within the confines of the float tank is likely at this stage. Something that hangs up practitioners who are in this stage often is the inability to breathe underwater. There can be the sense that the body that exits the body.
I'm gonna interrupt because I am curious. So absolutely. I assume you're basing a lot of this on your personal phenomenology. How much of this is cross-validated? Like what's the N here? How many people for each of these stages? How many people have you talked to who've experienced kind of similar?
Yeah, it's a great question.
Progression.
So the people who have experienced up to state space 2, as I define it here, are individuals who have recognized that getting into the float tank and in proximity to their sleep cycle is going to have a profound impact on the progression of their tank practice, basically. And the number of individuals who have access to the float tank that have encountered this on a regular basis, where to they're de-reifying salient pieces of this puzzle, is in the 5 to 10 range. Small, okay. Small sample size.
Small, but there's
the amount.
there's some consistency between more than just one person.
Yes. Definitely. Yeah, for sure. And then and specifically, like, those people are people who, like I mentioned, have access to the float tank on a regular basis.
Right.
I have talked to some aspect of these things that I've described. I mean,
I'm sure to many people and bits and pieces.
Yeah, I almost want to say like 100 people at the float center have communicated like some or one of these aspects. Like, all of a sudden, kind of like seeing that the interior of the float tank is illuminated is also like a characteristic part of this, these two phases. And like, I've heard people have reports of being able to look at their hands, like, clearly, the outlines, like the walls of the float tank, that the light in the float.
Me, for instance.
Totally.
That happened to me. Yeah, like the light was definitely off, and there is no light getting into that tank, and yet, from a predictive processing perspective, or doesn't have to be that, from the perspective that our mind is actually generating the phenomenal world we inhabit, in a indirect realist. Of course, if you're used to reifying this space, sensory input is taken away, it might just keep reifying it.
Of course. Yeah, and the interior of the float tank, for what it's worth, has really minimal phenomenal content. Like, they're white walls that are curved, and even if light is reflecting off them, it's kind of hard to tell where things end and begin. So when you get the orientation to the float tank and I show you the interior, I would imagine that the mind just models it extremely fast.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, because there's just not much to it. So yeah, basically, like, the thing that will make you move past this second phase of this second space or whatever is the ability to phase through materials.
Which we can connect to dream yoga here if you weren't already going to.
Yeah, sure. So something that is talked about in many classical texts from as early as the Pali Canon is this feature of being able to go through solid objects, for lack of a better. There are all sorts of different.
And create a mind-made body.
Yeah, and create the mind-made body, and also the simile of
touch the sun and moon,
the sword in the scabbard. This metaphor is used in the context of in the early Theravada, in the Pali Canon, specifically the Iddhipada Vibhanga Sutta, which is in the Samyutta Nikaya. I think it's 21.20, if I'm not mistaken.
I'll put the link down in the description if you want to go read that sutta yourself. This is kind of the locus classicus within the Pali Canon for the development of the supernormal powers.
Yeah.
And what they are, their enumeration.
Yeah. So this would be referred to as the power of transformation in the Pali Canon style. Phasing through materials is a feature of this iddhi. Whether or not, depending on your frame, whether, lucid dreaming is a power or not is like, totally up for scholarly debate. But
it's certainly powerful.
Yeah, certainly. Although, it's like the float tank will certainly produce some really fascinating phenomenal experiences, but the powers may not be dissected by insight unless one has the frame and the wherewithal to do so. The Iddhipada Vibhanga Sutta is an insight framing on the powers as I read it. Like, it is not simply a feature of shamatha practice done well. It is an extension of the insight path to that any given location that the body that exits the body ends up in can also be dismantled with Vipassana practice. And this speaks volumes to like the cosmology of world systems, where you might end up, et cetera, et cetera. yeah, using insight practices to continue the Vipassana track on multiple planes. Yeah, super helpful. I mean, super incredibly productive for insight practices. And
everyone I know who has practiced in the context of lucid dreams or has continued their practice past the point of out of body experience developing, it's a ripe time. It's a ripe platform from which to do any practice, any insight practice.
Yeah.
The mind is incredibly malleable within that. State.
Yeah.
And it's not one state, but
yeah, it is really fascinating. The diaspora of states and phenomenology in this territory is quite wide. It's quite wide. So yeah,
Space 3.
Space 3. Exiting the confines of the float tank is the main feature. And the way that one does this, it can happen in a variety of different directions. Bottom exits are quite common. Back exits are also a little more common. Then top exits are actually quite uncommon in the sense that one is like, on the parallel and just goes whoop, straight up. What is way more common is yoink, doink. Or if the space is reified, another common one, especially at the beginning of this, the transition from 2 to 3 is kunk. Kind of pressure into phasing through is quite common. And truly, like when I say pressure, like the sense of being like pushed can be quite powerful. Similarly, it's possible to get stuck in the wall where you kind of only half phase, like you get your arm through, but the whole bag is not there.
That sounds like a teleportation gone wrong or something.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, the Harry Potter, like getting splinched on apparates. And the thing is, like, it's basically like if you get splinched, it's like you reified the material separation of the body, whatever part, and the wall as being different. And then since they're not in like perfect alignment anymore, it doesn't work, and you perceive pain. It can be quite uncomfortable to.
I imagine.
I mean, and it can be radically uncomfortable to, make it all the way too. Because oftentimes, like during these exits, they can be quite violent. The sense of moving at really fast rate.
Sure.
That
extreme acceleration.
Acceleration is quite common in the way that, and also like that acceleration is not just like yoink. There's a lot of like very common like contorting and
twists, compressions.
Yeah, absolutely, and elongation too, which can be wildly uncomfortable.
Getting spaghettified.
Totally. And that sort of it's funny how the like black hole like framing of these things can get kind of lodged in the mind, because oftentimes the third space, the phenomenological representation of it, is a massive black void. Sometimes you can look up and see the part of the float tank that you exit suspended in that space. That is absolutely in the cards. Coming in and out of the float tank over and over, like that's totally possible. But as one matures into the third space, what tends to happen is that one just becomes comfortable being with the body that exited the body being suspended in this giant black void. And the sense that there is, or that there could be like directional movement through it, starts to not make sense, because there's no reference points from which to measure distance whatsoever.
Right.
But, the sort of like, when I said that it may be like, it's not a fully boundless space, it's like there may still be the sense of bounds that may just like, like the horizon line of the visual field, for example, may reify the sense of like the spherical nature of that space, when as you continue, like even the idea of shape does not compute to the mind any longer. Yeah. So that's kind of like coming into a mature third space recognition. The fourth space is, in a way, the vastest of the spaces, because it could be any manifestation at all.
This would be like the mind made malleable. Is frequently, or in dream yoga, like it's traditional that you can go anywhere, you can do anything, you can see anything, you can experience anything.
Yes.
If you can imagine it, it can happen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that the sense of depending on how proficient you are in your dream yoga practice arc, the sense of being able to like fabricate bespoke environments to your preference, that is typically not till way later down the line. And what first starts to happen is you're in the big black void, and then boop, all of a sudden you're in a some place that has features. Like it could be your room, but usually earlier in the progression, what actually happens is you may end up like in a space that's like outside of the float tank, that's in your kind of immediate physical locale, and the mind just models the space that it thinks the physical body is in. Sure. But that is still absolutely valid fourth space territory. And there's a way that, like I said, that these things are incepted. It's like the second space is actually valid fourth space territory too.
So now here's a question. Yeah. Within the fourth space, have you then gone into a float tank in the fourth space?
Absolutely. Oh my God.
Yeah.
It's one of the most major, interesting phenomenological features. Is reified as a existent space to such an extent that you start to encounter them in other places, and you can get inside of them and float in them. And
it's like lying down to sleep in a dream, yeah, and then starting up another dream.
Yeah, and one of the curious...
Or waking up from a dream and then you're still dreaming. Same.
Yes, absolutely. One of the most curious features about this, though, that is really functionally useful in practice is that when you get into these tanks and other locations, the time dilation is even more insane. And you can reify the sense of phenomenal time in float tanks in other places to the extent where you're like, it's like 8 hours of real time seems to pass in the incept. You can get more practice done by reifying phenomenal time in tanks in other locations. It's so dope. It's amazing. And yeah, like that's really where you can start to see the nested nature of samsara. Really gnarly.
Of this whole magical web of illusion, as it is described in some places.
For sure. And, it's also quite common, like, that you may skip the third space entirely. I mean, even though you didn't, like, that's also incepted, but just, walking out of the float tank into a completely alien environment. Like, that's absolutely in the cards. I mean, that's happened to me more times than I could possibly count. I'm going to get out and take a shower now. And it's just like, nope, like you're on a spaceship, alien race cars, like, you name it. So yeah, the fourth space is really anything and anything that can happen in typical dream phenomenology, right? And similarly, dream yoga phenomenology. Like that is the space where these things get done. Now, there is some interesting territory that, because oftentimes, like, it's like there's this sort of phenomenon of like third space, very clear, boom, fourth space, something is happening. But as you progress in your practice, the transitions between third space and fourth space can get considerably more elaborate. The sense of being able to see at a distance the realm of the fourth space that you're about to enter and penetrate like a membrane with the illusory body is very possible and will happen often. The sense that the boundless black void has all of a sudden phenomenal content that is equally representative of the total infinitude of that space can occur. And that's...
Are we talking like lattices and matrices,
yes.
Infinite in extent, that kind of phenomenology?
Indra's net kind of stuff with, tons and tons of infinite nodes. That can then be, sometimes it depends, like you can have it depending on how reified the sense of the illusory body is, those nodes can be like examined, gone in between. There's something that happens, this manifests in a couple ways. Like one of them can be a kind of like a rotating kind of like tornado looking thing with like, a bunch of different like screens and the like, and you can kind of like select one to penetrate. Like it can manifest in all sorts of fascinating ways. Also on the table here is like the sun and moon kind of thing. Like these kind of like major like celestial body encounters. Typically they can, it depends. Like sometimes they can occur from the third space going into the fourth space, and the encounter with one of these bodies or nodes brings you into the fourth space. But also if you kind of do the same thing in the fourth space you did on the transition from the second to the third space, whereby you break the physics in the fourth space realm by doing like flying, for example, beyond the boundary of the sky in the dream, where you pop the membrane. This is where like the kind of, oftentimes that can be a manifestation of like the arising and passing away phenomenal stage. It's like a major like, whoa! Flying dreams are really common in that territory, and breaking the boundary of that thing can be quite common. But something that happens like speed, the sense of speed and distance being manipulated is very important, in the sense that if you do it enough, what will happen is that there will just be these huge gaps in between the spaces. And oftentimes they manifest like black holes. They look like black holes. You're moving so fast that all of the information from the content is being compressed around the outside edge of this massive whole space. And a frustrating point in practice can occur if you try and penetrate this black hole space. Like, what's on the other side of the black hole? You get closer and closer and closer to it, but it's just this infinite regress. It's like, and the body can get really elongated, et cetera, et cetera. But, the transition often from the fourth space to the fifth space.
All right, number 5. Tell us about number 5.
This is kind of one of the important points, is just, what is the opposite of every and all possible manifestation? So
gone.
So the cessation of perception, feeling, and consciousness is the fifth space, and what can happen is, on approaching these like very compressed, this like confluence of extremely high information against no information, is that the sense of dimensionality becomes totally gone, and the sense that like the illusory body is at any distance from anything just completely collapses. Right. And at first it may manifest as if like everything is this impossibly thin sheet, impossibly thin, and then it just can just it manifests in a variety of ways to sort of collapse into cessation.
Well, you're describing Three Doors phenomenology essentially within this very I don't know what adjective to use. This exotic entry point.
Exotic is good. Yeah. Exotic is good. So and then basically, like, out of the fifth space, any of the spaces can arise again, and seeing the reconstruction of phenomenal reality is the bee's needs.
Pretty generative for insight. Revealing, facilitates recognition.
So
generative might not be the right word.
Perhaps not. But as one continues through this, these phases of, I hesitate to call them like spaces, I guess, maybe stages. Like, I mean, these things kind of break, the right words kind of break down at this point, but everything becomes available all the time. And yeah, it's a remarkable trajectory for insight practice, is how I'll put a bow on this. Like, it would be extremely easy to just get lost in the
content,
stunningly ridiculous content. I mean, outrageously beautiful to absolutely terrifying. Just terrifying. I mean, like, in this, like, I can't even begin to explain like some of the terrifying things that
I mean, I can only imagine. Minds can produce, well, anything. So.
Anything. It's all on the table.
All on the table. Yeah.
And kind of other salient intelligences like that also have bodies, like, very common in fourth space, like communicating with these things is absolutely.
Oh, sure. Just like dream characters or entity encounters under various conditions.
Yep.
Sure.
Yep. So all that is available here in the float tank. Most of these kind of, I hesitate to even say that these are high-end phenomenon, like whatever high-end or exotic practice is.
By whose bar?
Exactly. by whose bar, and who's to say who is going to encounter what based on their proclivities and karmic inclination. It's really, really hard to say. And by any one of these spaces, one could hit liberating insight. No one of these is more profound than any other, due to their totally incepted nature.
Well, I mean, from an ultimate perspective, these are all just fabrications, right? Including.
Let's go. Yeah, totes my goats. And this is. I just want to tell people that this is available in the float tank, and.
Which I don't think people know.
I'd like to transition from this into the next topic, and which is basically, why is it that in our current kind of practitioner culture that the float tank has not been utilized or considered. As in the Buddhist context specifically, because
I mean, even explored, it's just not.
Yeah. So, like, what are the barriers here, and what one of the things that occupies my time and my life and my thinking is, how do we get more serious practitioners into the float tank? And when might it be an appropriate time for them to start engaging with it, and why? And, how do we make it accessible? And how is the float tank part of the fourth turning of the Dharma?
That's a great question.
It's so alive for me. It's incredibly alive. When I think about the things that have unfolded over the course of 3 years, that's not that much time.
And you're one guy with a bunch of friends who are doing kind of similar things.
Yeah, kind of. I mean, I'm friends with people who have access to the float tank, but I am obsessed with it.
I think that will be clear to people.
That may be a slight, this is a once in a lifetime opportunity. I do not know when access to the float tank as a condition will end. And it is, for whatever reason, part of this manifestation that it must be engaged with as much as possible before the end. And I don't know when that is, so I have to. Got to. Do you have thoughts about, when might be an appropriate time to introduce a practitioner to the float tank? And do you think that there are certain practices that are especially good in the float tank and not others, or is it free ball? And I'd love to hear what you have to say about this.
I mean, I'm thinking about this kind of on similar lines to the potential usefulness and hazards of using substances in tandem or in conjunction with the path, however one conceives of it. If nothing else, substances or the float tank, given enough time, will certainly convince someone of the malleability of mind. And if with a little nudge, it's not far for at least an informed inference, if not direct recognition, of the emptiness of perception. It makes it impossible any longer, especially if one has repeated experiences. This is all true of the meditative path, right? If you get deep enough into samadhi or insight practice, it is impossible to take appearances at face value.
Yes.
So minimally, it's another avenue for that. And that could be introduced at any point. For people with already some skill, like some navigational skill within their own mind, this is just, I would consider it an accelerant, basically, like other kind of retreat conditions, basically. Something like dark retreat or, highly tailored and tuned retreat formats that offer different things.
Yeah.
It's just another one of those that is kind of especially intense.
Yeah.
Given my own brief experience, although I floated a lot within a day, I would, novice. And I was coming off the heels of,
Yeah.
I don't know, 5 or 6 days of full-time practice when I got into the tank. And I basically wanted to try everything I knew out in the tank. And I found not so much that the arc of practice differed very much for all of these different practices that I tried. And that, include jhana, insight practice, some practices from Vajrayana that I know, some mantra stuff, deity yoga, other things. The arc of practice did not alter that much, but the conditions of sensory deprivation, temperature equalization, total darkness, weightlessness, this is also probably a function of me having been on retreat leading up to the experience, but the arc of practice was accelerated. And there also, and maybe you could speak to this from your much more experience, just time in the tank. I found with repeated entry into the tank over that day, I came to the exhaustion of phenomenal content quicker. Not necessarily that I was hitting the cessation of perception and feeling every time I went in, but it I just hit boundless, formless space real quick. After a certain number of repetitions, it's like I had to do some practice that included some element of fabrication or move my body, or I would just involuntarily slide into a state of minimal fabrication, in which there's, something like the eighth jhana, basically, where there's consciousness, but there's no discernible content whatsoever, and there's no will, there's no intention, there's no movement, there's no sound, there's no sight, there's no, just barely conscious. Deeply, deeply restful. Yeah, and that happened quicker, basically, each cycle that I went in.
Yeah, I think,
And I found it like more annoying to maintain some fabricated practice as the time went on.
yeah, sure, that tracks. Yeah, that tracks. I think also something that was compelling to me about the way that you engaged with the float tank was that, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think like you stayed in there for more than an hour at any given stretch, and your first couple
No, I
30
didn't.
minutes in duration.
Oh yeah, the time dilation I experienced was bonkers.
Yeah.
Again, probably a function of me having ramped up on retreat prior to showing up at your door. But yeah, like I you could have told me that I was in there for 2 hours, and I would have believed you each time I went in.
Sure. And the reason why I mention that, Whiston, is because I have a suspicion that for practitioners who already have consolidated insights into a variety of axes of development may not need much time in the float tank.
Well, I'm also curious. Next time I come round, I'd like to do something of 3 or 4 hours in duration, just to see what happens.
I think that one of the interesting, really, like for me, the most compelling part of the float tank experience right now is when the mind says it's time to get out and just not getting out. In this phase of time, been in the float tank for, the REM cycle has resolved, whatever kind of like, residual integration of that thing has occurred. One kind of has the, perception that the peak emergence is over, and they're
just staying in past
just really sending.
And do you end up hitting another peak emergence after that, or do you just stay in a maximally defabricated state?
That is one of the interesting things about this. There's a variety of things, like sometimes I get pissed. Like it hurts. It hurts to continue to stay still. After all this.
And at that point, it's essentially kind of serving the same function as a strong determination set of many hours of duration.
Totally. Yeah. So there have been times where that just facilitates high equanimity, and you just you just start looping, and that can have terrific utility, because it's like the conditions of the float tank are so ideal. Like this weightlessness, temperature homogeny, it's amazing. It's like, if I get out of the tank right now, it's not going to be any nicer than this. And
well, unless you need to pee.
Yeah, and that's the other thing. Like, if you want to do long floats, like you got to take serious special considerations about fasting, not drinking water, and those things are a major axes of development in and of themselves. And that is, like
on along traditional ascetic principles.
Yeah, sure, exactly. Same lines. But yeah, so I find that it is possible to loop REM cycles. Like there is a point where these strong determination sits like can go back to peak emergence. But like I find that like 2 full loopings, like it's quite rare in my experience. is
Sure.
quite
Yeah.
rare.
Yeah, that makes sense.
My longest float,
there's just not that much in the tank. That was my perception. Is
Yeah.
like hitting peak emergence and then you just slide involuntarily sliding into a state of maximal defabrication, and then remaining in I don't know how long. This is where the time dilate. Like I don't know how, and then there's no intention. It's just like things just kind of gently, without intention, refabricate to like a minimal degree. I'm aware that I'm in the tank again. I guess it's time to get out. I don't know how long I've been in here.
Right. And like, that sense of like curiosity and like subtle time pressure refabricating is like, how do you work with that? How do you work with that? And staying in the tank longer is like really profoundly deep restlessness. Like, yeah. And that's where this axis of development is the most fascinating to me. And in my estimation, this is actually the least charted territory in the float tank for all any and all practitioners that I've ever heard of.
We're talking about extreme sports of contemplative high weirdness here.
And I think I think distance floating should be a sport for what it's worth. I think team floating is the future of the float industry. Ocho for floating. Wow.
I think we've about covered what there is to cover about the float tank.
Let's leave it there.
Maybe we should also say something about the Roxiva.
Absolutely. Yeah, let's talk about the Roxiva.
Or stroboscopic stimulation in general.
Yeah, okay. We're going to be talking about visual flicker entrainment. If you wanted to look this up, this is what you would look for. The mechanical devices are sometimes referred to as stroboscopic light machines. And there are a variety of these machines that are available, and of which normal strobe lights and those things where you can like see a belt kind of freeze in time when you're checking the RPMs of that thing. I think they literally call it a stroboscope. Like there are all sorts of strobes out there, but visual flicker entrainment is this practice of looking at a stroboscopic light machine or some strobing light source with your eyes closed, and you see these very fascinating fractal geometries behind the eyelids. Colors that are totally endogenous. These stroboscopic machines, they use white light. So when you look at them, you see these beautiful rainbows, and I mean, it's just insane. Really beautiful.
For those with familiarity with certain kind of levels or doses of NN-dimethyltryptamine experience, similar kind of elaborate crystalline fractal whatchamacallit, that kind of phenomenology, especially with some of this higher end stroboscopic stimulation, that kind of thing can manifest. And depending on your degree of samadhi going in, right, you may just completely lose track of the body, be absorbed, and the geometry may become more than two-dimensional.
Yes, that definitely tracks. The higher frequency light that you look at, the more it becomes a whitewash. Things can appear in that wash for sure, and it can do warpy and weird things. But there's different frequency bands of stroboscopic light have different visual signatures, which is super important, I think, to the utility of this technology in the context of Buddhist practice. When me and Whiston got together, the machine that we were using is called the Roxiva RX1, and it is a high-end stroboscopic light machine. It has 16 LEDs in like a diamond-shaped array like this, and it can do mixed frequency entrainment, so it can do multiple frequencies at once. so the interference patterns can become really complicated, basically. Winston, I'm curious if you just say like your first impression when you got under it.
Oh,
What would you say?
sure. I think I just kept saying, "Whoa, holy shit! What the fuck? Whoa, holy shit!" And I tried I tried less powered. I'm not sure what the dimensions of the technology are. You'd be better able to fill out the technical specs than I can. But I've tried a couple of these devices. Friends have asked me to try them, and this one is just on another level.
Yeah. There are glasses units that you kind of put up.
Right. There's the Casina device, I think it's called.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm sure there's a bunch of different brands.
Sure. And, they have extremely small LEDs that are in much closer proximity to your eyelids than the Roxiva is.
Right.
For what those devices are in terms of their hardware, the phenomenal effect is quite impressive. Not to denigrate these smaller or less expensive devices at all. They're really quite impressive. The Luminate app, for what it's worth, just using the strobe on your cell phone to experience,
which I've done. Yeah. Yep, that alone is pretty impressive.
It's incredibly impressive. And if you're curious about experiencing visual flicker entrainment, I would absolutely recommend the Luminate app to anyone who's curious. It's fascinating. However, people have told me, they're like, yeah, I've tried these other light devices and I get it. The Roxiva is insane. It just, and I've tried the other high-end ones as well. Like the ones that, like the Roxiva costs $5,000. It is an expensive piece of kit. I've tried
probably far overpriced for the hardware, but no one else is making anything like that at the moment, as far as I know.
Yeah, so I've tried the other high-end ones. This one is different. It really has, the visuals are the most sophisticated in terms of their interference patterns that I've ever seen. It has like 225 different sessions, like at all of these different frequency bands, et cetera, et cetera. It's a great piece of kit. But what's the point?
Sure. What is the point?
Cool. Like, cool experience.
Might as well just go to an art gallery or take LSD or whatever.
Sure. Yeah, totally. Let's get into like what might be the point here. So some of your listeners may be familiar with Casina practice. Some of them may
probably
not.
Fire Casina.
Yeah. So yeah,
or I mean, Fire Casina being probably the most widely known version of that practice.
Sure. You're looking at a colored disc for a long time. You get the retinal burn. You close your eyes. You look at that after image until it fades away, and then you re-up on the object, and you just do that until the object becomes the internal object becomes totally solid, the nimitta, as it's referred to, and that becomes the object of your meditation.
Yep.
Cool.
And then that becomes more solid, stable, attractive. You can kind of collapse into it, enter a non-dual absorption. Various things can happen.
Yeah, tons of fascinating phenomenology in Casina practice. The interesting thing about these Casina is that on the apparent level, they appear to be solid when you're looking at them, right? What happens if your Casina is deliberately flickering while you look at it? And how does that impact the phenomenology of nimitta when the external object is so obviously flickering, either at consistent rates, variable rates, and not only that, but the object, you're not looking at the Roxiva with your eyes open like this. You're engaging.
That would be terrible for your eyes.
Yeah. I mean, you would get the retinal burn immediately. That would be a hilarious Casina object too. But in any case, you're looking at these, constantly shifting fractal visuals. At the most fundamental level, if you had it at just one frequency at some rate, right? It's just on off, on off, on off. The Roxiva has the capacity to do a wide variety of waveforms. The frequency in hertz, the intensity of each one of the individual lights itself, the ability to divide the array into quadrants, makes this effect possible. But in any case, like in my experience, I should also say, like, one of the things that is fascinating to me about the Roxiva and the way that I've engaged with it is to do it in high doses. Like, what happens if you do 4 hours of visual flicker entrainment for like 5 days in a row? What happens? There's no documentation on anyone using these products for long periods of time in either semi or actual retreat style practice. So I'm like, what happens when you do this? And one of the things that I have found is that you will start to see the stimulus without the stimulus.
Which also happens with regular casino practice, or if you're doing hard jhana practice, that'll happen.
Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah. So because like the things that are compelling to me about this are the following. When the endogenous stimulus, I don't know exactly what to call it yet, but when the endogenous stimulus starts to occur, the phenomenology of it has this quality of being like inverse to the like color profile of what is seen.
Yeah.
And also,
right. Yep.
But the like latticing of the nimitta is a distinctly different quality than what is seen on the front end. And it is like, tessellating, moving at a different rate, and also flickering at different rates. So what's curious to me is like, what happens?
If folks haven't already guessed, we think this is a good gateway into impermanence practice, or just standard vipassana on the visual field, taking the nimitta as an object.
Yes.
Yeah.
At the first level, yes, absolutely. Like anicca all day, send it. Like characteristics. Yeah, I mean, and anicca just so powerful. Like worth doing on every sense gate, worth doing on the visual field, 100%. What is also compelling though is the sense that you may be able to phenomenologically categorize the flickering rate of the tessellations and the pulsation of the endogenous stimulus and synchronize it with the external nimitta such that the there's a canceling out and gonzo. And this sort of this like chrysanthemum phenomenon as it pertains to three doors phenomenology on the front and the back ends is significant with using the Roxiva prior to doing insight practice. If you re-up on it, it can make some of these like signatures seem like more obvious in this way. And like, I'm deeply curious about whether or not, like it can be used as kind of a two-way biofeedback mechanism to better understanding the phenomenology of, both the front-facing part and the back-facing experience. So yeah, I'm not super good at talking about this yet.
I think next time I visit, I will try some longer duration. Maybe I'll have a better idea of what you're talking about.
Yeah, that would be deeply helpful. And it's worth noting, like, when I look at the like QRI heart page, that thing that they just released, like, their visual models of 5-MeO and NN, the phenomenological similarity of both the experience under the lamp and the endogenous experience of the lamp is remarkable. It is remarkable, and I don't fully understand the cool tool that they made with like the kind of different sheets that like you kind of synchronize them together. I
don't understand
yeah,
it
I don't.
either.
But when I saw it, something in my gut was like, this has to do with that.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, and that was just incredibly compelling. And yeah, doing the Roxiva before you enter the float tank
potentiates can do quite a lot.
Yeah, the likelihood that you'll see more complex like phosphine latticing prior to entering the float tank, that you'll start seeing these patterns in the dream yoga arc of things, and again, just anicca steroids for
we're looking at performance enhancing drugs for one's shamatha and vipassana practices here.
However, I would like to say like non-pharmacological
performance
altering
enhancements
interventions that are.
It's not clear whether any pharmacological drugs are of that much utility in the classical shamatha or insight paths, so remains to be seen.
And
but these ones really, for my money, these seem more useful for than
mechanical psychotechnologies is like the way in which that I've been referring to them, and I'm deeply curious about the the future of mechanical psychotechnologies in this fourth turning for the Dharma, and like how why are practitioners curious about these things, and there's a way that like different kinds of ritual objects are also mechanical psychotechnologies. Precisely, there are these things in the diaspora of Buddhist practice. I mean, even the robe is like a mechanical psychotechnology. Like, it depends.
Every element that has been crafted. I mean, this is true of all religions, actually. But it all is intentional, right?
Yeah.
It serves a specific function, the symbology, and its use in cultivating and refining states of attention, states of awareness, recognitions, refreshing those recognitions, leading the mind to perennial insights about its own nature, right?
Yeah.
None of it is accidental.
Yeah. And it's like, what are the ones in this era? What are they? And I like suspect strongly that like the float tank is, I think it's one of the greatest human inventions of all time. It is a remarkable invention. To encounter the float tank in a lifetime is an unbelievable gift. And like,
you sound like a gospel preacher. I mean, it is pretty fantastic. He's not actually overselling it. It really is really cool, especially if you go in for extended duration or stack multiple floats.
Yeah. Density matters, folks. Density matters. It makes a huge difference. Dose really matters. But please be warned, the float tank can be outrageously powerful, and use it with the understanding that it can cause ontological and paradigm shifting
shock.
Shock. Have informed consent about that aspect of the float tank should you engage with it, especially as it interfaces with any of these practices. I will also say, just because the scientific materialist paradigm and peer review are such strong dominant epistemologies in our society, like I want to say that there is no research about the intersections of mindfulness, meditative practice, and the float tank. We do not know if people are actually falling asleep in the float tank. There's been no study that verifies that to be true. We have never studied floats that are longer than 90 minutes in duration. So in terms of the scientific paradigm, like validating that the float tank is a suitable place to practice meditation and mindfulness, I have no evidence in that paradigm by which to stand by that statement, to give an affirmative
I
one way.
mean, I think we can bridge off of that. Go try it for yourself. Here's two Gonzo meditators who two thumbs up.
So yeah, Ehi Pasico. But yeah, float tank research has a long way to go, and we're in the Wild West. We don't know what the float tank does. We don't know what it's for. There's some great studies that show the 60-minute float intervention is a remarkably positive intervention for generalized anxiety. National Institute of Health. There's flotation research that shows it's amazing for anorexia nervosa, using the mechanism of dissolving the perception of the boundaries of the body. Like, there's really compelling.
It's also just great for stiffness, soreness, joint tension.
Yeah.
It's just you feel fantastic.
Totally groovy. There's nothing like weightlessness. It does something that nothing else can touch. Wow. That was cool.
It's been an hour and 20 minutes.
Yeah,
I think we should start to wrap. Is there anything final you'd like to say, and do you want me to direct people to a website or anything?
I don't really have an online presence. If I do work at Go With The Float in East Hampton, Massachusetts. You can check out our website. I do facilitate sessions of the Roxiva. My company is called Stroboscopic, www.stroboscopic413.com. I mean, that's where, you can find me, I guess.
If there are any other float fanatics out there and they want to get in contact with you, I assume they can do that through some link on the website or somehow.
Certainly. And I lurk on Float Tank Reddit, F Posterhead is my Float Tank Reddit handle, I think. I don't know. I don't know. It's been great talking to you, Winston. Really legendary. Always a pleasure. Really.
Always a pleasure. Likewise. Right. Take care, folks. Thanks for listening. I hope this is of some interest or benefit to you, and take care out there.
Natural Awakening Podcast. Let's go.